I wasn't in a good place that winter, and I had quit pretending otherwise by the time I hauled my last steel rack up the mountain road to my mother's old bakehouse above Black Creek. I was 42, with hands that knew dough and burned scars better than handshakes, and I had gone from running a respectable little town bakery to counting coins in a chipped coffee mug on a shelf by the flour bins. My wife, Erin, had been gone 11 months. The debt had outlived sympathy by a wide margin. Folks were kind for a while, then life did what life does and moved on. I sold what I could, packed what I couldn't bear to throw out, and came back to inherited land I used to swear I'd never live on again. I did not come for peace. I came because there was nowhere cheaper to fail. The bakehouse sat where the spruce thinned and the wind picked up speed, a one-room brick and timber building my mother had run for 20 years before her knees gave out. The place had a broad wood porch, a stone spring house set a little downhill, and an oven built from old river brick that held heat like a stubborn memory when you fed it right. Inside, everything smelled faintly of yeast, smoke, and wool. The prep table still had her knife marks in it. The peg by the door still held her green apron. I left it there. I slept in a narrow cot behind stacked feed sacks and woke every morning to cold that settled in my joints before my eyes even opened. Black Creek winter arrived early that year and took the whole valley by the throat, not with pretty snow, but with wet cold that seeped through boots, door seams, and bone. By the second week of November, my mornings had turned into the same failing routine. Up at 3:30, lantern on, water bucket checked, starter checked, fire checked, then checked again because I couldn't trust my own head before coffee. The starter had gone sluggish from the chill and looked like paste some mornings, barely breathing. I'd warm it by the stove, talk to it like a fool, curse it under my breath, and beg it to rise while I split kindling in the dark with my shoulder aching. Then I would mismeasure salt, dump a batch, start over, and stand there staring at flour dust, floating in lantern light, like I had all the time in the world. I did not have time. I had 2 delivery routes left, one pickup truck that hated cold starts, and a ledger that looked worse every Sunday night. I kept inventory like I was defending a courtroom case no one asked for. 40 pounds bread flour, 12 rye, half a crock of honey, 3 sacks of feed for Rusty, my old red hound, who had gone grey around the muzzle and still followed me from door to door, as if I might vanish between one room and the next. 2 cords split, 1 1/4 stacked dry. Pipe tape needed, chimney sweep overdue. I wrote every figure in a black notebook with squared pages because numbers felt cleaner than grief. Grief had no lines, no margins. It leaked into everything. It sat in the silence while loaves proofed. It stood in the doorway when I set 2 mugs out by habit and put one back without looking at it. Erin's recipe tin rode in the back of my truck for 3 weeks before I brought it inside. It was dented on one corner, painted blue once, now mostly scratched to metal, and full of index cards with her tight block letters and little side notes she wrote for me when I was too proud to ask why my rye kept cracking at the crust. One night, I sat on an upturned flour bucket with the tin in my lap and the lantern turned low, listening to sleet tick against the windows. I opened to her card for molasses brown and found a grocery list tucked behind it in her handwriting. Oranges, dish soap, thyme, birthday candles. No date, no context. Just ordinary life stopped mid-sentence. I put my palm over that list and said out loud, "I'm trying." The room held that sentence and gave me nothing back. There were no villains in my story unless you counted weather and time. And I did. Black Creek winter was the thing I fought each day, and it had patience that made mine look thin. The creek mist froze on the back steps by dawn. The springhouse line crusted over twice a week. Flour clumped. My knuckles split. If I let the oven cool too much overnight, the first firing took hours and half my woodpile. If I overfired to compensate, I scorched crust and wasted flour I could not afford to waste. A primary consideration was simple. If I missed enough bakes, I lost the few customers who still drove up for bread and pies. If I lost them, I lost the place. If I lost the place, I had no framework left for my days except getting through them. That was the crux of it. Most evenings I shut the door after clean-up, carried stale loaves and heels in a feed bucket, and walked to the cedar stump at the tree line where the yard gave way to timber. My mother used to leave scraps there, rain or shine. She'd tap the bucket and say, "Nothing in these woods should go hungry," and I used to roll my eyes like any son who thought he was more practical than the woman who raised him. Still, habit runs deeper than opinion. I left the bread, set the empty bucket upside down on the stump so raccoons wouldn't nose it all over the yard, and stood a minute listening to the trees settle. Rusty sat beside me, tail thumping slow on the frozen grass, nose lifted to scents I couldn't read anymore. He was my only regular company by then, and he had a way of looking at me that made me feel both seen and gently judged. One night I dropped a stale heel and muttered, "Don't start with me." He sneezed, then leaned his shoulder against my shin hard enough to nudge me off balance. I laughed in spite of myself and said, "Yeah, all right, you win." It was the first laugh I'd had in days, short and rough, but it counted. Back inside, he took his place by the stove and watched the door while I weighed flour for morning, as if guarding me from the dark itself. I knew better than to call that noble. He was waiting for dropped sausage. Still, we took care of each other in the plain way old dogs and tired men do. By Thanksgiving week, I had settled into a narrow life built on work and avoidance. I baked before dawn, drove downriver to 3 stores and a diner, came back up the grade with empty racks rattling in the truck bed, split wood, mixed preferments, mended what broke, and went to sleep too tired to dream. I stopped answering most calls. I told myself I was busy, which was partly true and mostly convenient. My sister Mara left voicemails that stayed warm and patient, no matter how many I ignored. "Just checking in, Dale. No pressure. Call me when you can," she'd say, and I'd set the phone face down and keep scraping bowls. Evidence suggests a man can make loneliness look like discipline if he keeps his hands moving long enough. The day before the first hard freeze, I found myself standing in front of the prep table with Erin's tin open again, staring at her card for sourdough Baytards. The margin note read, "Steam pan full first 10 minutes. Trust your timing, not your nerves." I don't know what came over me except plain fatigue and the kind of ache that has nowhere useful to go. I pressed both hands to the table and talked to her like she was in the next room. I told her the starter was weak, the truck needed brakes, the accounts were a mess, and I was so tired of being brave for nobody. I told her I didn't need signs or miracles. I just needed one morning that wasn't a fight from the minute I opened my eyes. Rusty lifted his head from the mat and watched me without moving. That night the cold deepened, wet and mean, and I did what I always did. I banked the oven coals careful and low. I checked the damper twice. I covered the splitting maul by the wood stack, then uncovered it to knock mud from the blade and forgot to cover it again. I carried stale bread to the cedar stump, set it down, and stood with my hands in my coat pockets while wind moved through the firs in long, steady breaths. There was no revelation, no sudden comfort, just a tired man in a dark yard, doing one inherited kindness because it was the only one he could manage that day. When I went back inside, I latched the door, scratched Rusty behind the ears, and lay on my cot listening to Black Creek winter press itself against the walls until sleep finally took me. I woke in the dark to Rusty's nails ticking once across the floorboards, then stopping, and for a second I thought I had overslept and lost the bake before it started. I reached for the lantern, knocked it against the crate by my cot, muttered to myself, and sat there with my breath making little white clouds in the room. The wind had dropped. That was the first thing I noticed. No sleet at the window, no branch scrape, no low creek roar pushed uphill by weather. Just quiet, thick as wool. Rusty stood at the back door with his tail moving slow, looking at it like someone had just knocked and he was trying to decide if manners applied. I checked my watch. 3:12. I swung my feet down, braced for the sting of cold through my socks, and didn't feel it. Not much, anyway. The room was warmer than it should have been after a banked fire and a hard freeze. Not hot, just holding heat in a way old timber doesn't do unless flame's been fed recently. I told myself I'd built the coals smarter than usual. I told myself plenty of things while I got the lantern lit and crossed to the oven. When I opened the iron door, a dry wave of warmth rolled across my face. The coals weren't dead. They were alive and bright at the core, red-orange under a thin white crust, exactly where I would have pushed fresh kindling if I'd gotten up an hour early. I crouched there with one hand on the brick arch, feeling heat soak into my knuckles. Then I stood, went to the damper, checked it again, and felt a little stupid because it was where I left it. Half open. Right drawer for banking. Nothing fancy. Did I get up and do this? I asked the room. Rusty gave one soft chuff without taking his eyes off the back door. I set coffee water on and started the starter wake-up. It had life to it this morning. Tiny bubbles around the edge, faint tang rising when I stirred. The practical part of me made a case right away. Draft angle changed, colder air outside, stronger pull. Brick retained heat. Maybe that's all. By the time I weighed flour, I had almost convinced myself. Then I went outside for wood and saw the splitting maul. I'd left it by the block, blade bare to sleet, handle wet. I knew I had. I could picture it. Now it leaned dry under the eave beside the door, exactly parallel to the wall like my mother used to set tools when she was done with them. No mud on the edge, no ice on the haft, just dry steel, dry hickory, like it had spent the whole night there. I stood in the yard in my coat and long johns with my hand on that handle and tried to backtrack every move I'd made before bed. Coals, damper, stump, latch, cot. I could remember each step clean. I could also remember enough nights half asleep these past months to know memory can blur at the edges when grief and fatigue tag team a man. That was the non-trivial part. I wanted one explanation. I had 3 thin ones instead. Back inside, I mixed dough while dawn took shape as a pale stripe behind the furs. Rusty finally left the door and curled under the prep table, but every so often his ears perked toward the yard, and he gave that same low, pleased rumble he used for neighbors he liked. Not alarm, not warning, just recognition. By first light, I had 6 sourdough rounds proofing and a pan of brown loaves ready to score. Steam rose from the kettle. The whole room smelled like wet flour and pine smoke, and that warm, sweet edge dough gets right before oven spring. It should have settled me. It usually did. Instead, I kept glancing at the back door like I expected somebody to walk in and claim a prank I could be mad about. Nobody did. After loading the first bake, I took Erin's tin off the shelf and set it by the scale. I didn't open it. I just rested my palm on the cold metal and said, "You asked for one morning that wasn't a fight. This one's odd, but I'll take odd." Rusty thumped his tail once against a flour sack, as if to approve the negotiation. The road down to Black Creek was rutted and slick, and the truck complained on every climb back up. But deliveries went clean that day. I spoke maybe 20 words in total. Morning. Still warm. 2 rye in the pie. At the diner, Maylene slid my invoice back and peered over her glasses at me. You look less haunted today, she said. Maybe I slept. Then keep doing that. That was the whole exchange. Plain and useful. By late afternoon, low cloud moved in again, and the cold got wet around the edges. I stacked 2 armloads of split cedar by the oven, patched a leak at the spring line with tape and cursing, and ran numbers at the prep table with a pencil nub until the page went soft from erasing. The math still pinched. Black Creek winter had not loosened its grip because I'd had one decent morning. A primary consideration remained fuel. If I burned too much, I bought wood I couldn't afford. If I burned too little, I lost batches. There wasn't room for mystery in that framework, and yet there it sat in my head anyway, stubborn as a burr. Near sundown, I carried the stale bread bucket to the cedar stump. The sky had gone that pewter colour that makes the snow line look closer than it is. Needles held yesterday's moisture in dark beads. Rusty padded ahead, then stopped halfway and looked back at me, waiting. It was the same look he gave when he wanted me to follow him to a rabbit hole he'd decided mattered more than my schedule. I'm coming, I said. You run this place now? He wagged hard enough his back half swayed. At the tree line, the woods were quieter than usual. No jay complaints, no squirrel chatter. Even the creek sounded muffled, like someone had thrown a blanket over the valley. I set the bucket on the stump, laid out 2 heels and half a collapsed rye loaf, then turned the bucket upside down. Routine complete. Still, I didn't step away. I listened. The stillness wasn't empty. That's the best I can say. It felt inhabited, but not crowded. There was a faint smell under the cedar and wet earth, something like clean animal musk and crushed evergreen, and it came and went on the lightest drift of air. Rusty sat at my knee, head high, ears forward, tail sweeping the frozen grass in slow, contented strokes. He wasn't scanning for threat. He was waiting for someone polite to finish approaching. I told myself that was projection. Grief looking for pattern. A lonely man reading social cues into a dog's posture because he missed being understood by anybody with words. I ran that reasoning cycle all the way through and nearly believed it. Then a chickadee dropped to the stump 10 feet from us, then another, then 3 more, bold as daylight. They hopped around the bread without the usual twitchy panic, pecking crumbs, fluffing in the cold, chirping soft and even. Chickadees in this weather are jittery little engines. These looked settled. Rusty watched them with mild interest and then looked back into the trees, tail still moving. I felt my shoulders loosen and tighten at the same time. I knew somehow I wasn't in danger. That thought arrived whole with no argument attached, and it made no sense to the part of me that trusted measurements over feelings. I stayed anyway. Dusk thickened. The first real dark reached the stump before the sky fully gave out, that blue-black wash you get under spruce, where depth goes flat. Somewhere off to my right, maybe 30 yards in, something heavy shifted weight on wet ground. Not a crash, not brush tearing, just a careful transfer of mass, 1 foot placed, pause, another placed wider than a man would step through that tangle. It circled broad, never closing distance, and each movement stopped when I turned my head toward it, as if courtesy had rules I didn't yet understand. Rusty stood, gave 1 small whine that sounded almost pleased, and took 2 steps toward the trees before glancing back at me again. "No," I whispered. "Stay with me." He came right back and pressed his side against my leg. I don't know how long we stood there in that shared quiet, my hand sunk in the rough at Rusty's neck. Listening to a presence moving with restraint through timber, it could have bulldozed without effort. The scale of it registered in pieces. Branches 3 feet off the ground ticking lightly. A shadow crossing between trunks where no deer should have been that tall. A low shape pausing behind a cedar snag, then easing out of sight with a patience I had mostly lost in myself. The cold finally pushed through my coat. My fingers started to ache. I backed away from the stump one slow step at a time, not from fear so much as the sense I was being given room and needed to return it. Rusty mirrored me exactly. When we reached the porch, he sat and looked toward the tree line again, then at me, like he was checking whether I understood anything at all. Inside, I latched the door and leaned against it with my eyes closed. The bakehouse felt warmer than outside logic allowed, though the oven had been down for hours. I fed 2 sticks in and watched flame catch. Then I grabbed my black inventory notebook and wrote what I could verify. Oven held heat beyond expected. More relocated under eave. Evening stillness atypical. Bird behavior calm at stump. Large movement in timber deliberate. No approach. I stared at that list until the words stopped looking like words. Evidence suggests a man can write down facts and still not know what to do with them. I considered calling Mara, hearing her say fatigue can blur a morning and loneliness can sharpen a shadow. She would not be wrong. I set the phone in my hand, then set it back down without dialing. At cleanup, I scraped the mixing bowl, rinsed pans, swept flour into the corner pile for morning, and tried to treat the night like any other. Rusty ate, drank, and took his place by the back door instead of the stove. He watched the lower crack of it with a calm attention that made me uneasy and, at the same time, less alone than I'd felt in months. Before bed, I stepped onto the porch one more time. Frost had begun to silver the grass. Moonlight, thin through clouds, touched the cedar stump and the edge of the yard. The bread was gone. Not scattered, not torn apart, just gone, as if lifted piece by patient hands. Beside the stump, where bare dirt showed through old needles, lay a small bundled roll of dry birch bark, tied with a strip of pliant grass, clean and ready for fire starting. I walked down to it slowly, crouched, and picked it up. The bark was bone dry despite the wet cold, peeled in wide curls from fresh fallen limbs, not hacked from live trunks. Whoever had made the bundle had folded each strip to the same length and tucked the knot flat so it wouldn't snag. Functional, thoughtful, no wasted motion. Rusty came to stand beside me and gave my elbow a firm nudge like, "Well, are you seeing this too? Or am I carrying the whole conversation again?" I held that birch bark in both hands, looked into the trees where the dark stood layered and unreadable, and said into the night, quiet but clear, "Thank you." No answer came that I could name, just the soft creak below, a light stir through the firs, and the steady sense of being watched over rather than watched. I went back inside, set the bark by the hearth, and banked the coals with unusual care. Then I took my carpenter's pencil from the shelf, knelt by the oven door, and drew a clean line in the ash where no log rested, a mark I would know by morning whether I had crossed or something else had. Rusty settled by the door again, tail tapping twice before he went still. I lay down on the cot with my coat still on and listened to the quiet holding around the bakehouse, no longer empty, not yet understood. I lay there a long time with my eyes open, watching the dim rectangle of window go from black to a softer black, listening for any shift in the room that might tell me whether I'd crossed that ash line in my sleep or whether the night had kept its own kind of company while I rested. Rusty's breathing stayed steady by the back door. Once, he lifted his head and gave a low, contented sigh toward the yard, then settled again like a guard who trusted the watch. At some point, I drifted off without meaning to, one hand still curled around the carpenter's pencil, like I might need to defend my own notes from morning. When I woke for good, the first thing I did was kneel at the oven before I even lit the lantern. The iron door warmed my knuckles through the chill. I opened it and saw live coals glowing behind a lay of kindling I had not set, fed in a neat little triangle for airflow, exactly how I'd taught apprentices back when I still had a storefront and 2 boys who complained about dawn shifts. My ash line was broken clean in one place and smudged by something broader than my boot edge. Not a drag mark, a press and lift, deliberate. I sat back on my heels and just stared at it. I wanted to feel panic because panic would have been simple. What I felt instead was alert, almost bright. Curiosity, plain and sharp, cut through grief for the first time in months. I worked the morning bake with that feeling humming under everything. I scaled flour, mixed, folded, loaded, and every task felt cleaner somehow, like my mind had been given a problem it could hold. I wasn't asking why Erin was gone. I wasn't bargaining with weather or debt or memory. I was checking facts. I found myself smiling once when I caught it. Rusty noticed before I did, came over, and leaned his shoulder into my knee hard enough to nearly spill a bowl of Levine. "You're smug," I told him. "Don't make it weird." He wagged without apology and trotted back to the door, where he sat in that same patient posture, ears up, not tense, waiting. After first deliveries, I drove down to the diner with a crate of rye and a dozen molasses rounds, and Maylene had my invoice ready before I hit the counter. She looked at me over her glasses again and said, "Still less haunted. You eat yet?" I shook my head. She slid me half a biscuit with gravy and pointed a spoon at me like a judge. "Don't answer unless it's yes." I ate, standing by the coffee urn, burn hot and too fast, and told myself this was ordinary life, just a woman feeding a stubborn man in a cold valley. On the way out, I called Mara from the truck because the signal was decent by the bridge, and because not calling had started to feel like lying. She picked up on the second ring. "Dale, you okay?" "I'm okay enough," I said. "Listen, I need you to tell me if this sounds like I'm losing track." A pause, then softer. "Go on." I've had 3 mornings now where the oven was alive before I got to it. I marked ash. Something crossed it. And there's been help, tools put up, firebark left dry as summer. I know how that sounds. She breathed out slowly. "Grief can blur mornings, yeah. You know I've said that. But you're not careless, and you don't make stories. Write it down, keep sleeping when you can, and don't decide what it means all at once." "I can do that." "You don't have to solve your whole life this week," she said. "Just bake today's bread." That line stayed with me through the climb home. By the 3rd morning after I drew that first ash line, I had started checking the backyard before coffee and writing observations before I touched the mixer. I added a second column in the notebook labelled "Could be normal" and forced myself to fill it, even when the entries felt strained. Draft pattern, heat retention, dog behaviour variance, human error. Then I'd add a third column labelled "Unknown" and put down what didn't fit. It was not elegant, but it kept me honest. It also kept me from sinking. Grief had been a sealed room. This was a window cracked open, cold air and all. That afternoon, I took Rusty along the timber edge after deliveries instead of heading straight for wood splitting. The snow line hadn't dropped yet, but the ground in the spruce hollow held that damp, dark give that keeps prints if you step heavy. I found impressions along the old game trail, each one sunk deeper than my heel would go, even with a flour sack on my shoulder, spaced wider than any stride I'd make on purpose. The toes were wrong for a boot, too broad at the front, tapering in a way that looked hand-like without being a hand. I crouched and set my feed sack twine across one, then measured against my forearm. I did it twice because I didn't trust the first reading. Rusty sniffed one print, sneezed once, then looked uphill with his tail moving in slow sweeps like he smelled a familiar neighbor. I wanted to run every practical explanation again, so I did. Bare hind over front in Thor mud can mimic odd tracks. Logging treads leave strange edges. Water slumps make holes look deeper. I told myself this couldn't be real, and I believed that sentence for about 30 seconds at a time before the evidence pushed back. The tracks skirted my seedling rows and my scrap pile. They avoided loose stone and chose firm ground near the wash line where a heavy body could move quietly. That pattern carried intention. I stood there in the dim green light under spruce and felt the old ache in my chest loosen by one notch. Not healed, just loosened. I knew somehow I wasn't in danger. Near dusk I reached the stump and found the stale bread gone as usual. But this time there was a careful little spray of wintergreen berries laid where the rye heel had been. Stems aligned, no mud on them. I laughed once under my breath because gratitude from the woods had better manners than half the customers I'd baked for in town. "All right," I said to no one I could see. Trade accepted. Rusty sat beside me and gave me a look that said I was late to an arrangement he'd already understood. I put my palm on the cedar top and felt the cold soak through my skin, then headed in to mix preferment with my thoughts running faster than my hands. 2 days passed in that new rhythm, each one packed with work and observation. The retired logger, Eli Mercer, came by for oat bread and stood by the flour bins rubbing heat into his knuckles while I wrapped his loaf. He watched me glance toward the back door when Rusty perked up and asked, "You hearing company up there?" I shrugged, gave him the wrapped bread. Maybe, hard to say. Eli nodded like that answer told him plenty. "Old Hill's got old company," he said. "Long as your dog ain't worried, I wouldn't borrow trouble." Then he tipped his cap and left, boots thudding slow on the porch planks. No smirk, no challenge, just a man offering the smallest framework for mystery and moving on. The morning I first saw him clear began with mist and a weak stripe of gold through low cloud, the kind of light that makes every wet board on the porch look varnished. I had loaded an early batch and opened the flower room window to vent steam when Rusty stood up from his mat in one smooth motion and trotted to the back door, tail high, not frantic. He gave a small sound in his throat, softer than a bark, and looked at me once as if to say, "Keep up." I wiped my hands on my apron and followed him to the cooling porch, every sense tuned hard. The yard held stillness without emptiness again, and there, at the far edge by the split-rail fence, a figure moved between mist ribbons and fir trunks. He was enormous, 8 feet, maybe more, with dark fur slicked in places by damp and shoulders broad enough to block half a doorway. Yet nothing in his movement carried force. He stepped around my winter kale starts without brushing a leaf, lifted one long leg over the low bean trellis I hadn't taken down, and ducked beneath the laundry line where my aprons hung stiff from yesterday's wash. Any man that size should have moved like wreckage. He moved like care itself, placing each foot where it would do the least harm. Rusty trotted 10 yards ahead, stopped, looked back at me, then back at him, tail working steady. It felt absurdly and unmistakably like an introduction between 2 shy neighbors. I gripped the porch rail so hard my fingers hurt. My breath went shallow, then deep, then shaky. I wanted to step back inside and lock every door, because that's what a man does when the unknown enters his yard. I wanted to walk out and set down fresh bread and stand there with empty hands. Both impulses lived in me at once, and the tension between them made time stretch thin. He carried a bundle of split cedar against one forearm, pieces cut to my firebox length. At the bakehouse wall, he knelt and placed them in a tight stack under the overhang where they'd stay dry, each piece aligned grain out for quick grab in the dark. Then he stood, turned his head toward me, and held still. His face was partly shadowed by the misted light, but I could see his eyes, amber-brown and calm, watching without crowding. No bared teeth. No challenge. Just attention. I felt tears sting before I understood why. Not fear. Relief, maybe, at having the question answered in flesh and steam and cold morning air. I heard my own voice inside my head, saying the line again, steady this time, like it had been true longer than I'd admitted. I knew, somehow, I wasn't in danger. He shifted his weight, slow and readable, then walked to the stump. He took one stale heel from last night's loaf, left the rest, and set down something small where the bread had sat. When he stepped away, I saw it was another bundle of dry birch bark, tucked with a twist of grass, cleaner than anything I'd gather in this weather. Rusty went to it, sniffed once, then sat. The big figure glanced from the dog to me and lowered his head a fraction. Not a bow exactly, more like respect offered at a distance. Then he backed into the timber edge. One step, then another, never turning his back until branches and mist folded around him. I stood on that porch long after he was gone, the oven heat at my back and cold, damp on my face, listening to chickadees settle into the cedar and Rusty's tags clicking faint against his collar while he nosed the bark bundle toward my boot. The world looked unchanged and completely altered at the same time. Same fence, same stump, same cracked bucket by the door, same ledger waiting on the prep table. But the frame around my days had widened. I had seen him move through my yard with a kindness I could measure in practical things. Unbroken seedlings, stacked wood, one heel taken, one gift left, and my grief for one clear morning was no longer the largest presence in the room. Rusty nudged the birch bark bundle against my boot again, and that small, practical insistence got me moving. I picked it up, ran my thumb over the grass tie, and carried it inside like it was as ordinary as flour sacks and invoice slips. The oven timer rattled from the hook by the window, reminding me I still had bread in the chamber, and I stepped back into my routine with my heart thudding hard enough to feel in my throat. I pulled the loaves, set them on cooling racks, checked bottoms for colour, rotated pans, all with that image still lit in my mind. The careful duck under the laundry line, the pause at the stump, those calm eyes holding my own without demand. When I finally looked at my hands, they were shaking. Not from cold, from having my world widened in one quiet minute and not knowing where to set it down. I put the bark bundle by the hearth with the first one, side by side, and opened the black notebook to a clean page. I wrote until the pencil point dulled. Time, weather, light direction, approximate height by fence rail reference, observed gait, load carried, contact distance, dog behavior, crop avoidance, gift exchange. Then I turned to the back of the notebook and sketched the yard map with arrows where he walked. I even measured the space between his steps near the trellis with my tape, and wrote that down too. I told myself this couldn't be real, and in the same breath, I knew exactly where his foot had landed beside my kale bed. I told myself grief could stage a whole theatre in a man's head, but grief had never stacked cedar under my eave. I wanted a neat framework, one sturdy enough to keep me from looking foolish. What I had instead was sawdust, numbers, and wonder, all mixed together in a way I couldn't separate. By noon, low cloud had burned off into thin winter sun. and I drove deliveries with a kind of careful distraction, answering folks in short sentences while my mind replayed every movement in the yard. At the diner, Maylene took my crate, paused and leaned in a little. "You look like you saw your own ghost," she said. "Not a ghost." She waited, spoon in hand, giving me room without prying. I said, "You ever have a morning where something true shows up and you can't file it anywhere sensible?" Maylene's eyes softened. "Honey, I run a diner in this valley. That's half my Tuesdays. Eat something before you float off." I laughed just once. "That's fair." Back up the mountain, I called Mara from the bend where signal came in and out like a weak heartbeat. She answered on the first ring this time. "I need to update my report," I said. "That sounds formal. Go ahead." I saw him, clear as I see my own porch, big, careful. Carried split cedar to my wall, took one stale heel, left birch bark. Rusty acted like he was greeting a cousin. Silence, then her voice, steady and low. "Do you feel scared?" "No. That's the part that keeps tripping me. I don't feel scared at all." "Then keep doing what you've been doing," she said. "Write it down, stay respectful, sleep when you can. I believe that you saw what you saw, even if I don't have a box for it." That mattered more than I expected. Not agreement on details, just trust in my plain account. When dusk came, I changed one thing in the ritual. I cut a fresh heel off a warm molasses loaf, wrapped the rest for morning, and carried that heel to the stump instead of the stale bucket scraps. Rusty walked close at my knee, glancing up at me like he knew this was a first. I set the warm bread on the cedar top, stepped back 10 paces, and sat on the porch step with my hands open on my thighs, where they could be seen. The air smelled of wet bark and chimney smoke. Chickadees moved through the lower branches in little hops, unhurried. I did not call out. I did not whistle. I just stayed still and let the yard hold what it held. He came at the edge of full dark, not from straight ahead but wide to the left, where the firs gave him cover and open ground both. I saw shape first, then depth, then the whole of him easing into view with that same measured economy, each step placed like he was reading my land and trying not to leave a bruise on it. Rusty stood, tail sweeping, and remained by me instead of running out. That was new. It felt like trust in both directions. The figure paused halfway to the stump and looked at me. I raised one hand, slow, palm out, the way I did with skittish colts years ago on a neighbour's farm. He held that look, then moved forward, took the warm heel between long fingers and brought it up once to his face as if testing the scent. Then he set down 3 dry cedar knots by the stump, kindling dense with pitch, worth their weight in comfort on a wet, cold morning. No rush, no flinch, no fear of me, and no pressure on me either. We shared maybe 20 seconds in plain sight that felt longer than whole months of my old life. And then he stepped back, nodded that same slight lowering of his head, and withdrew into trees that seemed to open for him and close again without a sound. I sat there until my knees hurt, staring at the cedar knots on the stump, and Rusty finally leaned against my shoulder in a way that said, gently, "Get up, Baker. You still have work." 3 days later, Black Creek winter made a hard push with freezing rain that coated every board and hinge in glass. By late afternoon, the wind had shifted crosswise against the bakehouse, and smoke began to curl wrong when I fired the second batch. At first, it was only a faint backdraft, a grey ribbon slipping under the iron door. I adjusted the damper. It worsened. The room took on that bitter, choking edge of smoke that stings your eyes and turns fresh dough sour if it hangs too long. I opened the side vent, checked the flue clean out, fed less wood, then more, trying to find the drawer again. Nothing held. Rusty paced between the door and the oven, uneasy now for the first time in days. Not afraid, but keyed up, like he could sense my panic climbing. The practical equation hit fast. If I killed the fire, I lost 2 full loads and maybe my starter warmth overnight. If I kept burning with poor draw, I could smoke out the room and ruin everything anyway. I grabbed the ladder and dragged it into the yard, boots sliding on the glaze. Rain ticked against my coat hood. The chimney rose above the roofline, black and slick, and I could see wind punching sideways across the cap in bursts. I set the ladder, tested one rung, then another, and felt it skitter half an inch on the frozen ground. My stomach dropped. One bad step, and I'd be down hard with no one nearby until morning deliveries came looking. I hauled it back, reset it wider, jammed split wedges under the feet. It still shifted. Smoke thickened behind me. Doe on the bench waited at full proof with nowhere to go. My hands went numb inside wet gloves, and I said out loud, to the rain, to myself, to whoever listened, I can't do this alone tonight. Rusty gave a sharp bark towards the tree line. Then another, not alarm, more like announcement. I turned and he was there at the yard edge, darker than the weather, rain beading and running off his shoulders. He crossed the distance in 6 long steps, stopped an arm's length beyond me, and looked from the ladder to the chimney, to my face. I stepped back without thinking, giving space. He took the ladder in one hand near the side rail, lifted it clear off the ground like it weighed nothing, and set it against the wall at a better angle than I'd managed in 20 frantic minutes. Then he pressed both feet beside the base, broad and steady, and held it while glancing up. I understood. I climbed. At roofline, the problem was obvious. A wind-thrown cedar branch had lodged against the cap, iced in place, half blocking the outlet. I tugged. It didn't move. From below, one massive hand reached up past me, open, waiting. I let go of the branch and shifted left. He gripped the iced limb, twisted once with controlled force and lowered it to the ground instead of dropping it. No crash, no wasted motion. I knocked loose packed slush from the cap with my gloved knuckles, checked the opening, and looked down. He was still holding the ladder steady, face tipped up through rain, patient as stone. When I climbed down, smoke was already drawing cleaner, pulled straight by the restored vent. He stepped around me, went to the woodstack, and selected 3 split pieces the exact size for a quick, hot re-establishing burn. He carried them to the back door and set them on the threshold, then moved to the chimney side where crosswind had been hitting hardest. There he stood, broad back to the gusts, body taking the first force while the flue warmed into proper pull. It was a simple, brilliant correction any old logger would recognize. Block the worst lateral wind for a few minutes, let the draft column stabilize, then let the system carry itself. Inside, flame caught clean. The smoke thinned and lifted. I loaded the waiting loaves, hands still shaking, and came back to the door. He remained by the wall until the chimney gave that steady, low-draw hum I'd listened for all my working life. Then he stepped away, looked once at me through the rain, and pointed, not with a jab, just a gentle extension, toward the porch corner where my maul and wedges sat uncovered, collecting ice. I nodded, swallowed hard, and said, "Right, I see it." He walked over, gathered the tools, and set them under the eave in the same exact parallel line I'd noticed that first morning. Then he turned toward Rusty, who had sat quietly through the whole thing, tail tapping the wet boards. He lowered one hand, palm down. Rusty leaned forward, sniffed, and pressed his muzzle once against those fingers, like he was sealing an agreement older than either of us. The figure straightened, took 2 backward steps, and eased into the trees as rain softened to mist. I stood in the doorway with heat on my face and wet cold on my back, listening to the oven breathe right again while the first rescued batch began to spring in the chamber. My throat tightened so fast I had to brace a hand on the jam. This kindness wasn't abstract, wasn't a story I could talk around. He had seen the exact point where my work was failing and met it with skill, restraint, and care aimed straight at what kept me alive. I pulled the loaves at proper colour 40 minutes later, set them on racks, and laughed through a set of tears I hadn't asked for when I saw every crust come out clean. That night I left 2 warm heels on the stump and added 1 small jar of molasses wrapped in cloth, so it wouldn't crack in the cold. Beside it, I set a note torn from invoice paper, though I knew he wouldn't read words the way I did. I wrote anyway, for the ladder, for the flu, for staying kind. In the morning the heels were gone, the jar was empty and clean, and in its place lay a tight bundle of resin-rich cedar shavings, dry as August, ready to light with 1 match. I stood at the stump with that bundle of cedar shavings in my hand and the empty jar still beaded with cold, and I felt a laugh start in my chest and catch halfway up like it didn't know whether it belonged to joy or sorrow. The shavings were curled fine, uniform cut from dry heartwood and tied with grass the same way as the bark bundles. Clean work done by someone who understood fire the way I did. Rusty nosed the jar, then looked into the trees with his tail moving in slow sweeps, calm as porch light. I set the jar in my coat pocket, held the bundle to my face and smelled resin and smoke and winter cedar. Then I said, quiet and plain, "I got it. We're square for now." Inside, I put the shavings by the hearth, right beside the 2 bark bundles, and made myself work in order. Mix first dough, feed starter, check spring line, stack kindling, record evidence. If I stayed with sequence, I could keep my head. I wrote the exchange into the black notebook, then copied it on a loose invoice slip and tucked that into Erin's recipe tin, not as proof for anybody else, just so I wouldn't gaslight myself a month from now and call this whole stretch grief fog. Around mid-morning, while I was scoring rye, the wind swung north and came hard. By noon, sleet started ticking sideways against the windows, and every crack in that old bakehouse began to breathe cold. Black Creek winter came in teeth first that week. The spring line crusted over twice in one day, then split where it bent by the stone trough. I patched it at dusk with numb hands, and a flashlight clenched in my teeth, while Rusty stood against my hip for warmth. The starter turned sullen again despite my best efforts, rising only half what it should, giving me loaves too dense for pride and barely good enough for sale. Mara called while I was hauling in wet wood, and I answered because I couldn't keep pretending I was carrying this alone. "You sound worn to the nub," she said after hello. "I'm upright. That's something." Upright is not a long-term plan, Dale. I leaned against the woodstack, watching sleet stitch silver lines in the yard. "He's still around, still helping. I'm not making that up." "I never said you were." Her voice stayed steady, warm. "But you're running on fumes. Promise me you'll sleep 1 full stretch tonight." "I'll try." "Not try, do it. The bread can wait one morning if it has to. You can't crack in half for a ledger." I swallowed and looked toward the cedar stump. "Yeah, okay, I hear you." I meant it when I said it. Then I did what I always did and worked past midnight anyway, because flour was low and customers were fewer, and the math never softened for exhaustion. I told myself this couldn't be real, this partnership with a silent giant at my tree line, and maybe if I kept saying that I could return to a world with 1 set of rules and no room for awe. But the room I lived in now had bark bundles by the hearth and tools lined under the eave by hands larger than mine, and my old explanations had started to sound like someone else's voice, reading from a script I no longer believed. On the 6th night of freezing rain, I missed a step carrying a water pail, and went down hard on one knee just inside the back door. Nothing broke, but I sat there in the dark too long, pale on its side, water creeping under the prep table, and realized I was shaking head to heel. Not just cold, spent. I cleaned up, reset the fire, mixed what I could, then bent to grab Erin's notebook from the shelf and knocked it into the narrow gap between flower bins where I couldn't reach without moving 50 pounds of sacks. I stared at that gap and felt anger flare fast and pointless. I kicked the bin, cursed once, then leaned both hands on the table and breathed until the room stopped tilting. By 3:30 the next morning, I was on the bakehouse floor with my back against the brick base of the oven and my eyes closed, meaning to rest 2 minutes before loading the first batch. Rusty stood over me, whining low, then paced to the door. Back to me. Door again. The fire had dropped to coals. The draft was fickle in crosswind, and my body had crossed from tired into that strange hollow where you can hear yourself moving but can't gather enough will to stand. I remember thinking, very clearly, I cannot lose this place, and in the same breath, I cannot hold it up one more hour by force. Heat brushed my face. Not a burst, a steady, rising warmth. Then the dry crackle of split cedar catching clean. I opened my eyes to firelight and saw him kneeling by the firebox, broad shoulders turned partly away to keep from crowding me, one hand easing a split stick into place with the delicacy of setting down a sleeping child. The scale of him still took my breath, but the movement held no strain, no show, only care and practiced timing. He fed one piece, waited for the draft to draw, fed another at a cross angle, then leaned his back toward the windward seam in the wall where the cold usually knifed through. The flame strengthened. The room warmed by degrees. My throat closed up without warning. I pushed myself up on one elbow and watched, and he turned his head just enough for me to see those amber-brown eyes in the low light. He looked at me once, then down at the floor beside my hand. Erin's recipe notebook lay there, clean and dry, set within arm's reach. He had pulled it from the bin gap without disturbing the stacked sacks. No flourish, no demand for thanks. Just the exact thing I had dropped when I had no strength left to retrieve it. Something in me broke open then, quiet and total. I covered my face with both hands and cried like I hadn't since the day after the funeral. Shoulders shaking, breath catching in ugly, honest bursts I couldn't control. I had held everything tight for 11 months. Debt, work, silence, the ache of reaching for a woman who was no longer in the room, and that pressure finally gave way in front of a being I had no framework for except kindness. Rusty came and pressed against my side, warm and solid. I lowered my hands and looked at the figure by my hearth. "Thank you," I said, rough as gravel. "For the fire, for all of it. I mean that." He did not move closer. He rested one knuckle lightly against the brick, a grounding touch, then inclined his head the smallest amount. Outside, wind pushed sleet against the boards in hard bursts. Inside, the oven took hold with a deep, even breath I could feel in my chest. I reached for Erin's notebook and held it to me like a man who had been handed something far more than paper. He stayed until the fire was stable and the room held working heat, then rose in one smooth motion and stepped backward toward the door, giving me clear space to stand first. I got my boots under me, swayed once, and steadied. Rusty sat between us, looking from him to me with that same old, patient certainty. The figure glanced to the prep table where my scored loaves waited, then to the wood stack, then back to me, as if confirming I had what I needed for the next hour. I nodded, wiped my face with my sleeve, and managed, "I'm on it." He turned, lifted the latch with careful fingers, and eased out into pre-dawn grey. I followed to the doorway, not chasing, just witnessing. He crossed the yard along the fence line, stepping around the frozen kale rows even now, and paused once at the cedar stump. He set one hand on its top for a heartbeat, then withdrew into the timber with the same unhurried restraint he'd shown from the beginning. No drama, no backward glance asking for anything in return. Branches moved, settled, and that was all. By first light, I had the first bake-in and proper draw in the flue. I moved slowly but cleanly, like my body had remembered its trade while my mind caught up. I wrote everything down between loads: time I woke, fire condition, notebook location, observed actions, my physical state. I took the empty jar from my coat and set it on the high shelf over the prep table, beside Erin's tin and the carpenter's pencil. Physical evidence stored where I could see it and not argue with myself later. When Mara called again near noon, I answered with flour on my wrists and said, "You were right about sleep. I hit the wall. I'm still here." She was quiet a moment. "Did he come?" "Yeah," I said. "He came, kept the place warm, kept me from falling behind the whole week in one morning." "I'm glad you weren't alone," she said, and left it there, which was exactly right. That evening, I baked 2 extra loaves I couldn't spare and could not afford not to give. I left them warm on the stump with a fresh jar of molasses and a strip of clean cloth wrapped around the glass so it wouldn't freeze crack in the night. Rusty sat beside me while the light drained out of the yard, both of us listening to chickadees settle and the creek mutter under shelf ice. He came just after full dark, took 1 loaf and the jar, left the second loaf untouched, and placed a ring of small river stones on the stump top, each one set edge to edge in a careful circle. Then he stepped back into shadow and was gone again before I could speak. Over the next 3 nights he kept wider to the trees. I saw him only in brief, gentle fragments: a shoulder between fir trunks at dawn, a long arm setting split cedar under my eave, a dark shape pausing by the stump, while Rusty watched with quiet trust. The 4th night, the loaf was gone, and no fresh stones were added. The 5th, he did not come until nearly morning, and all he left was 1 clean birch strip laid across the stump, like a simple line drawn under a sentence. I understood the gesture even if I could not name its full meaning. At sunrise on the 6th day, the yard held bright frost and stillness, and 1 deep print stood in the mud by the stump where Thor had softened the top inch of ground. Beside it sat the completed stone ring, tighter and more deliberate than before, closed with 1 flat oval rock at the north edge. I crouched there with Rusty at my shoulder and set my hand inside that print without pressing down, just measuring span and depth, then lifted my palm and left it untouched. I did not cast it. I did not photograph it. I marked its location in the notebook, noted temperature and light, and let it remain what it was: evidence and gift in one shape. That night, I left bread anyway. Not from panic now, not from bargaining, from gratitude, plain as flour and water, for a winter morning when I had nothing left and found I was not carrying the dark by myself. The next morning I stepped out before first light with a warm heel in my coat pocket and found the loaf from last night, gone from the stump, cleanly taken, no crumbs, no torn crust, just the faint circular imprint where it had rested on cedar. The stone ring sat closed and quiet, the flat oval still at north, rimmed with hoarfrost that made each rock look outlined in silver. Rusty stood beside me with his nose lifted, tail moving once, twice, then still. We listened to the trees and heard only creek water muttering under ice and the soft click of branches rubbing high overhead. I set the new heel in the center of the ring, touched 2 fingers to the cedar top, and went back inside to fire the oven while the sky turned from slate to pearl. By the second week of February, the routine between us had become practical enough to feel like work partnership, not miracle. I left bread after clean-up and checked the wood line at dawn. Some mornings there were split cedar sticks stacked under the eave, some mornings only bark curls or resin knots, and some mornings nothing but the tracks of small birds around the stump. When crosswind hit, I found a windbreak of deadfall set near the chimney side, arranged to cut the gust but keep spark clearance. When sleet turned the yard to glass, my maul and wedges were always tucked dry and parallel, and my kindling stayed covered whether I remembered or not. Black Creek winter kept pressing, wet and persistent, but it stopped gaining ground. The oven held. The starter revived. I stopped losing batches. I stayed open. Mara came up on a clear Sunday with 2 grocery sacks and a look on her face I hadn't seen in a year, half worry, half relief. She stamped mud from her boots on the porch and hugged me hard enough to crack flour dust from my jacket. Inside, she set down beans, oranges, dish soap and thyme without commentary, and I had to look away for a second when I saw the thyme tied with twine, like Erin used to buy it. Rusty leaned against Mara's leg until she scratched his ears and called him handsome liar. She watched me feed the fire, then said, "Show me what you've kept." I brought down the black notebook, Erin's tin, the carpenter's pencil, and the 2 empty molasses jars from the high shelf. I laid out the bark bundles and cedar shavings by the hearth. I showed her the page where I mapped yard paths, the ashline entries, the weather notes, the calls with timestamps, even the line where I wrote my own condition after I hit the floor. She read in silence, lips moving on some words. When she reached the entry about waking to heat and finding Erin's notebook set by my hand, she closed the cover and pressed her palm to it for a long breath. "I don't need to solve it," she said finally. "I just need to know you're telling the truth." "I am. I know." I told her I hadn't called any agency, hadn't sent photos, hadn't asked for experts with plaster and cameras to come trample the yard. She nodded before I finished. "If you had, they'd turn your life into noise," she said, "and maybe chase off the one thing that helped you stand back up." That was my read, too. She pointed at the notebook. "Keep writing anyway, not for proof, for memory." After lunch, she walked with me to the stump. The ring was still there. She crouched by an older, weathered impression that had hardened at the edge where shade held, measured it with her hand, then set her hand back in her coat pocket without touching the center. She gave me one of those long sibling looks loaded with 10 questions and no accusation. "Did he ever come close enough to scare you?" she asked. "No." "Did Rusty ever warn?" "Never once." She stood, brushed her knees and said only, "Then treat this place like shared ground." That was all the revelation she offered and all I needed. 3 days later, I carried rye and oat loaves into the diner and found Eli Mercer at the corner stool with his cap in both hands and his coffee gone cold. Maylene took my crate and jerked her chin toward the counter. "Sit. You look human again," she said. I sat. Eli studied me, then the flour burn on my sleeve, then the way I kept glancing at the weather through the window like a man listening for shifts. He said, "You still getting help up that ridge?" I answered plain, "Yeah." He nodded like a bolt had seated where he expected. "My daddy used to leave windfall apples on a stump above our camp. Said some winters you fed what you couldn't name and got through because of it. I laughed at him till I was 30. Then one January I woke to my trapline gate, Eunice 3 mornings running. He shrugged, not mystical, just practical. Old hills got old company. You don't chase it. You don't brag on it. You say thank you and keep your fence mended." Maylene topped off his coffee and looked at me over the pot. "You planning to tell everyone?" "No." "Good," she said. "Town doesn't know how to hold a quiet thing." That resolved the last of the loaded looks for me. Eli never embellished, never asked to come up, never pushed. Maylene never teased, never pried again. They gave me room and treated my bread like bread, which was a gift of its own kind. In late February, during the final hard snap, the pipeline locked just after midnight, and I woke to dead cold metal under my hand and a starter crock going flat. I pulled on boots, hauled water from the spring house by lantern, and found split fuel already waiting under the porch bench, where drifting snow couldn't reach it. I fired the oven with bark and cedar shavings that caught on one match, fed small and steady, and kept the chamber warm enough to hold the levain alive till dawn. Rusty kept watch at the back door, calm. I checked the stump at first light and found one clean birch strip laid straight across the ring, like a carpenter's line saying, "This is true. Keep it square." Black Creek winter made its last push that week and failed to close me down. That mattered in ledger terms and in bone-deep terms both. When Thor finally came in March, it arrived as drip and mud and the smell of wet earth waking. I carried bread to the stump at dusk 3 nights running and found it untouched each morning, crusts damp with dew, chickadees pecking crumbs from the edge by noon. On the 4th morning, I knew he had gone upslope or deeper timber for the season, same as deer and weather both shift when the valley softens. There was no dramatic farewell, no sign torn into bark, just one deep print near the cedar where mud held shape for a day, and the stone ring intact, patient as a promise. I noted it in the book, then closed the book and put it back on the shelf. I changed the business the next week in a small, stubborn way. At dusk, I set a crate by the porch with a hand-painted board that read, "Free bread, take what you need." First night, 2 loaves disappeared before dark. Second night, a young father from downriver stood by his truck with his hat in his hands and said, "You sure this is all right?" I told him, "Take 2. Kids eat toast, same as anybody." By the 3rd week, folks started leaving what they could beside the crate. Eggs, a sack of potatoes, 2 jars of peach preserves, a split armload of dry pine. Not charity exactly. Circulation. A framework of mutual aid built from crust and habit. I kept every physical piece that belonged to that winter and accounted for it the way I account for flour. The black notebook stayed on the high shelf, pages dry, dates clear. Erin's recipe tin held duplicate slips of the key entries, including the night of the ladder and the morning by the hearth. The carpenter's pencil went into the tin after it wore too short to grip. The 2 empty molasses jars I had left at the stump stayed washed and upright by the window, and I used one for wildflower stems in summer. The bark bundles and cedar shavings were used as intended to light bread ovens through the worst weather. None were wasted. The stone ring I never moved, the deep print I never cast. Rain took the print, and I let it go. Present day, when people ask why I still walk to the Treeline every night, with a loaf heel in my hand, even in fair weather, I give them the plain answer. My mother taught me that nothing in these woods should go hungry. One winter proved that rule runs both directions. I do not need broad belief, arguments, or headlines. The prevailing fact in my life is simpler. Grief used to be a sealed room, and now it has a door. Erin is still gone. I still miss her when I reach for the second mug. Debt did not vanish by magic, and weather still comes mean some years. But I am no longer alone inside my own days. Tonight, as the last light went amber on the fir trunks, Rusty's old collar hung on the porch peg, and a younger hound slept by the stove, paws twitching in a dream. I carried fresh bread to the stump, set it in the stone ring, and stood a minute with my hands in my coat pockets listening to the creek run full with thaw water. Chickadees hopped low in the cedar. The yard held that familiar, inhabited quiet. I touched the stump once and headed back to the oven, where tomorrow's dough was rising, warm and alive.